Hello, friends. Jim here. Welcome to Science Talk. Interesting article that was published in the online publication EOS, dated 2 October 2023. Arctic ice loss could shorten winter feeding time for zooplankton. The Arctic's thinning sea ice allows more light to penetrate deeper into the ocean, holding zooplankton far beneath the surface. And I'll explain more about why that statement is important later on in this video. So here's a photo from the Arctic showing as the Arctic sea ice thins, more sunlight can reach further down into the water column, actually extending what's called the photic zone. So Hawk Flores still remembers a late September day during his first Arctic expedition 11 years ago when the ship's sampling nets came up, quote unquote, blinking with bioluminescence. Basically, what was in the net were a bunch of tiny copepods that had begun the seasonal ascent from the deep to spend the winter foraging on the underside of sea ice. You may recall I did a video discussing uh, sea ice algae. Well, when you have algae on the underside of the ice, that provides not only a place for the zooplankton to hang out, but also to feed on mm, the phytoplankton and graze a little bit on the algae itself. Flores is now a polar ecologist at the Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, Germany, has co-authored a study warning that ongoing ice loss in the Arctic could force copepods and other zooplankton to stay at depth for longer, cutting their winter feeding time by up to 1 month. Now, here is a photo of a copepod. This is a member of the Calanus genus. And you can see here's the scale of about 1 millimeter. So the antennae are pretty long. So we're talking an overall body length of about 1.5 to 2 millimeters. Doesn't sound like very much, but these guys are important in their role in the food web. Typically, what you have uh, Calanus, you have pseudocalanus, you have neocalanus. Those are kind of eucalanus. Those are kind of the major genera of copepod that you typically would find uh, in northern latitude oceanic waters. The Arctic has been losing sea ice at the rate of about 13% per decade since the start of satellite monitoring. That goes back about 4 decades. As ice flows shrink and thin, more sunlight is able to reach deeper down the water column. Tiny floating zooplankton move up and down the water column in a finely tuned balancing act between finding microscopic food under the ice and searching for safety from predators in the darkness. Okay, now let me explain the significance of the statement holding zooplankton far beneath the surface. Zooplankton undergo what's called diel vertical migration. And basically, it is migration up and down the water column, so it's vertical. And what they do is they hang out in deep depths when it's daylight out, where they hang out below the penetration of the photic zone, which makes them less visible to predation. Then, as it gets dark, they move up in the water column and start grazing. They basically move into the photic zone where productivity is taking place, and they graze. If the sunlight is reaching further down the water column, they're not going to move up into the photic zone because then they'll be seen and get picked off. Well, We also know that the Arctic is unique in that you tend to have 24 hours of daylight, for several months of the year. So that is really going to impact what's called secondary productivity quite dramatically. Primary productivity is the producers, the phytoplankton, increasing their biomass. Secondary productivity is the grazers, the zooplankton, doing likewise. And then you have small fish that eat the zooplankton, and so on and so forth. Light intensity, Flora said, is an important signal for this vertical migration. And this happens throughout the world's oceans. It happens in lakes. This is a thing that zooplankton do, whether it's freshwater or oceanic. They undergo vertical migration. In the Arctic, however, where the sun sets only once a well, okay, that statement, sun sets only once a year, is not correct. Okay, when you have, like, for example, this time of year, yeah, where you around the equinoxes, the sun sets daily. It may happen that when you get into November, the sun goes down and doesn't come back up until, depending on the latitude, some point in January or February, and then it'll set daily until you have the extended y- not setting during the summer month. So that statement is not correct. Winter active zooplankton move up to feed on ice, algae, and microbes during the polar night. They prefer twilight conditions to avoid predation and stay below a certain light level known as a critical irradiance, ascending only when this light dims as the sun goes below the horizon. Previous studies tracked Arctic zooplankton as they migrated, suggesting that their ascent was particularly sensitive to low light intensities. But uh, the data collected was not complete or not collected at all. In 2020, scientists aboard the German icebreaker Polarstern tethered an autonomous package of instruments to an ice floe to collect data as it drifted more than 1,000 kilometers through the darkness of the polar night, from close to the North Pole to offshore Greenland. For 6 months and across the two twilight periods of the Arctic fall and spring, the instruments tracked zooplankton density in the top 50 meters of the water column and simultaneously measured irradiance below the ice. Okay, here's a photo of researchers at work. You know, this is science being done. Basically, that's an ice auger drilling a hole in the ice, presumably to drop some instrumentations through the opening. The data show that irradiance must be as low as 2.4 times 10 to the minus 4 watts per square meter to trigger the zooplankton's ascent, which is a very low light level. And that typically is obtained during twilight or total darkness, and along with sufficient amount of snow and sea ice to attenuate, scatter, the light that is coming through, said Gail Vessier, a sea ice physicist at the British Antarctic Survey and a co-author on this study. So basically, another factor to consider here is whether or not there is a snow covering the ice. If it's just ice, sunlight is going to go through the ice more readily. If it has snow on top of it, the sunlight won't penetrate through. So that'll make the conditions darker, reducing the irradiance, and the zooplankton will like that. So that's another factor that needs to be taken into account. Bessier and Flores and their colleagues then used four global climate models to simulate a future sea ice retreat and resulting changes in light transmission under two scenarios. One in which reduced carbon dioxide emissions keep global average warming below 2C through the end of the century. Not likely. and another representing a future with a 4.4 C warmer average temperatures, more likely. The model showed that if ice loss in the Arctic continues unabated, by 2050, zooplankton will spend up to a month longer in the deep, less time feeding, which poses uh, a challenge to the survival of the species. Previous observations were limited in snapshots in time and space, said Tom Langban, a polar scientist at the University of Bergen, not involved. Observations like these help fill important gaps in our understanding, establish a baseline of ecological interactions. They also improve data quality because we tend to sample from research vessels that are lit and noisy. Oh, that's that's true. There is an inherent but often neglected bias in such samples. This bias can be minimized by using autonomous platforms. Well, yeah. The light will drive away the zooplankton. The noise will drive away organisms. So that's a legitimate critique and concern. The climate simulations the group used required some innovation because the models can't account for light levels below about zero point 0.5 watts per square meter. The researchers had to develop a separate model to capture irradiance during twilight because we know that light is coming in even though the sun is below the horizon. That's due to, the angle of the sun, the light bending through the atmosphere because the, the sun rays have further travel through the atmosphere and so forth, and the tilt of the axis, etc. During the twilight period at the start of the Arctic winter, organic matter produced by a late season bloom of ice algae becomes a critical source for winter active zooplankton. Think of sea ice like a sponge. There are little channels and caves filled with brine where detritus can accumulate. Migrating zooplankton species cannot build up enough fat stores to get through winter in a dormant state. They need to feed throughout. But changes in light conditions that will accompany thinner sea ice mean zooplankton will arrive at the ice underside later, missing most of the food. This will likely have follow on effects for the Arctic food web and carbon fluxes. Copepods are tiny crustaceans that make up one of the largest groups of zooplankton. The bioluminescent copepods Flores saw on his first voyage, Metridia longa, are one of the most abundant species in the Arctic Ocean. Another important seasonal migrant is the centimeter-sized Calanus species. Calanus copepods are the main food of the polar cod, which is the main food of seals, and so on, Flores said. Any negative repercussions for the zooplankton will have impacts on the whole food web because the zooplankton is the switch that transmits the carbon to higher predators. Now, for the Callias copod is a overall term. You have pseudocallus, you have callus. These I'm naming the different genera. You have neocallus, you have eucallus. The eucallus are the big boys. Those are the ones that can reach about a centimeter or so in size. But they feed the polar cod. Polar cod feeds the seals. Who preys on the seals? Polar bears. So you cause a problem with the zooplankton. This all crashes. So this is of major concern. So this is something that we're going to need to keep an eye on for and see what happens to secondary productivity as sunlight penetrates further into the water column due to losing ice. Yet another issue that arises from a warming planet. Thank you for your time.